This video is going to address Augustus and the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which he initiated as emperor. In the last lecture, we talked about Augustus coming to power as a nephew of Julius Caesar and bringing an end to the Roman Republic and bringing about the Roman Principate. Augustus would start out on a propaganda campaign that I'm going to talk about for a good portion of this video, and then talk about his successors that will go down to Nero, and upon his assassination, the Julio-Claudian dynasty will end. And indeed, all four of the ones after emperors after Augustus were assassinated. However, Augustus, there's some rumors that he was, some that he wasn't. In any case, it just shows you the extreme dysfunction of this dynasty. Probably the most famous one out of all of them in history, and the one that Hollywood focuses on. They have a very complex family lineage. There was the Julian family and the Claudian family. I don't expect you to know this, of course, but those purple squares are the ones that became emperors. And we can see that there was bizarre relationships between them. And strangely enough, the successor to Augustus, Tiberius, was not even a blood relative of Augustus. Having failed to have any sons, he basically would hand over power to his wife's son from a former marriage. But back to Augustus and his propaganda campaign. So Augustus comes into power as Octavian. He changes his name to Augustus and realizes that being a emperor, being a dictator, basically, is against Roman tradition, because they had been a republic for so long, being run by a senate. So he'll do things in art that will help promote this new type of government. And one is he gets the greatest writer of his time, Virgil, to write an epic called the Aeneid. And perhaps many of you had to read this in Civ or read parts of it. Virgil had already written many poems prior to this. The Aeneid would be the last thing he would write. Indeed, he would, on his deathbed, he would ask for it to be thrown out, but this, of course, would not happen. We see on the right here a mosaic of him sitting down in the middle, and then sort of, I don't know what they are around him, flanking him, one person with a theater mask, another person with a scroll. In any case, this is not a piece of art you need to know. But what I want to point out is that Virgil's book is a follow-up of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And it's really hard to understand the Aeneid unless you know the Iliad and the Odyssey. Because it's a direct play on them. And the Aeneid is a Roman Iliad and Odyssey. And what it does is it deals with a Trojan hero rather than a Greek hero, a Trojan hero by the name of Aeneas. And in the Iliad, Homer cryptically states that Aeneas is in a battle, and his mother was Aphrodite, Venus to the Romans, and that he was about to get killed, and she sweeps him off the battlefield and saves him, and then, to paraphrase Homer's words, to build a new Troy. And then it's left at that. The Romans would pick up on this, and especially Virgil here. It's not that this story was unknown, but basically that Romulus and Remus was the origin myth for the Romans. And I've already talked about that when I talked about the Capitoline Wolf. Well, the story of Aeneas would replace that, and indeed make Romulus and Remus descendants of Aeneas. You'll probably all remember from Civ that Homer has two books, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is about Achilles battling the Trojans near the end of the war. The Odyssey is about the Greek hero Odysseus trying to return home to his island of Ithaca, getting lost upon the way, and the various travels that he had, and hence we use the word Odyssey to this very day to be a sort of a long and maybe tortuous route towards something. Both books are 24 chapters or books. Both epics, I should say, are 24 books, both written in a meter called dactylic hexameter. Virgil would write the Aeneid in dactylic hexameter. He would only have 12 books, not 24, and he would reverse the order, where he has Aeneas traveling for the first 6 books and traveling to Italy, and then the second 6 books, him battling the local tribes to establish what would later become Rome. And so there's a lot of references to the stories in Homer, and that's because most Romans do Homer inside and out. It was the Shakespeare and the Bible combined almost of their literature. It's something that everybody knew and could recite. So when he draws parallels to Roman history with Homer, everybody gets the point. And right off the bat in Virgil's Aeneid, Virgil gives the list of descendants from Aeneas all the way down to Julius Caesar himself. Interestingly enough, he talks about how Aeneas' son Anchises, when they got to Italy, they called him, the boy from Troy, basically, like we would say a New Yorker. Now, another name for Troy is Ilium. Iliad is the things that happen in Ilium. And that his nickname was Illus. And that Illus would become Julius, and then eventually Julius, as in Julius Caesar. And so this name would change over time, but goes straight back to the Trojans. So the Romans were just like the Greeks, but they were on the other side. And this book is till this day one of the best pieces of Latin ever written. There's been many translations. Robert Fagel's translation here is quite good, but it is brilliantly written piece of literature, but straight out propaganda. But it would be referred to by the Romans for centuries after that. Indeed, we find there was a homework assignment found in Britain when the Romans took Britain, where a child was practicing the lines of Virgil and writing them over and over. So here was a literary piece of his propaganda. Now let's go to the art. We talked about the Augustus Prima Porta in the last lecture, where he's shown as the emperor, as well, the leader of the Senate and the leader of the army combined together. And here he's shown as the Pontifex Maximus, which means the chief priest. So he not only is in charge of all civil and military affairs, he's also in charge of all religious affairs. Now, I want you to pay attention on the right. You can see the cut on the back of his cloak there. You can't see it at the bottom of his neck, but basically, this is something I've referred to before, where the heads were made separately from the bodies, and then they were being inserted into the body. So a bunch of bodies could be made that say a priest, and somebody like Augustus comes around and says, "Okay, I want a statue of me as a priest." Well, then somebody else just has to make a sculpture of him with the veil over top, and they insert it into the body. This would be Augustus's traditional face. This looks just like he looks on the Augustus Prima Porta. These 3 locks on his brow are sort of famous for always being shown here. These emperors would have these busts sent all around the empire, so everybody knew what the emperor looked like. Just like when we go to the post office, there's always a photograph of the president there. Now, back before our times, before photographs and or TVs especially, people didn't know what the president looked like, so you had to have a picture of him there. So this was more important of a function than we have today. And so here we see him taking on a religious attitude, standing in contrapposto, a walking contrapposto, like the Doryphorus once again, and looking out serenely and seriously with an august manner, and showing his piety. And indeed, Augustus would have a lot of rules, religious rules that he put into place. And he would do strange, well, first of all, he emphasized family and family values, as they say. And he also would want the Romans to, marry within the Roman bloodline, as it were, sort of to keep things pure, as they say. And so he did this via religious practices and imposed a lot of laws on morality. His family would not obey them as much as he would have wished, but here we see him expressing that idea. Another piece of propaganda was the Areopagus, the altar of peace. We can see it was made in 30 A.D., a little bit after Augustus's death, but in honor of him uh, and referring to him, as we'll see in a moment. This was only discovered in the 20th century. It was originally painted, and it is an altar, a place where people would come and sacrifice animals, an abattoir. So you would line up, you'd walk in these frontal steps, and inside there is an altar, and an animal would be sacrificed by a priest. Now, what's interesting here is that he makes the altar two-piece, because remember Augustus brought about the Pax Romana after the many civil wars. He wished to bring about stability. And this is one of the reasons he was basically accepted by the Romans to a great extent, is because they were tired of the civil wars and the danger, and they felt a dictator was the only way to go. So this is a religious monument. There are two registers, relief sculptures on the outside. The bottom has floral decorations, but the top shows a lot of humans. And what it shows actually are the people actually standing in line to wait until they get to the altar. And there are many attempts to define who specifically is being shown here. Some are certain, some are not. We see a child being shown here, once again, sort of promoting Augustus's family values. But what I want you to pay attention to in this relief sculpture is that Augustus is copying the Greeks and what he would have seen at the Ionic frieze at the Parthenon, where they showed the Panathenaic procession happening. And so he shows this happening, this religious event as well. And let's go to another slide to reinforce these ideas here. And one of the things that's really interesting is a new technique in showing depth in the relief sculptures. Notice the people behind are a little bit lower. Okay, that makes sense. But they're also shallower in relief. And this would be a Roman way of, or a Roman development upon Greek relief sculptures, is to make the relief shallower if they're behind and deeper if they're in front. And then notice the children are shown in deepest relief to make them stick out, to remind the Romans of their responsibilities to the family. And then as they line up, they chat with one another, and it's very sort of casual in some ways, but respectful to the acts that would happen. We see here just another relief sculpture. This shows sort of Mother Earth there, breastfeeding two babies, and showing the fertility and the fecundity of the Roman Empire and their deities, and being flanked by two females with these veils in the background framing them. So this was also just another religious act here, showing some of the animals below her that would be sacrificed to at this altar at this time. Another interesting piece of artwork is called the Ravenna relief, which dates, all we can date it to is generally the Julio Claudian date. Ravenna is a city on the east coast of Italy. But what's interesting here is that it shows Augustus as Jupiter on the far right, standing there very muscular, holding his scepter, and he is crowned, and his robe dropping off to show his muscular torso. And there are several members of his family to his right or left. Now, these are very detailed stories that we won't go into, but the important thing to know here is that these are real people. And though the detail is not as good as what we've seen in many busts, to the Romans they would have been recognizable. Notice, by the way, that Augustus is a little bit bigger than the other people because he's more important, although it's not overdone here. Now, Augustus, when he would pass away, was one of the longest, uh, emperors that had been around in a long time. Ancient historians would say there was people that lived under him who never knew that there was another emperor. And so when he passed away, power went to his stepson Tiberius, shown here. Once again, well, first of all, we see this very Julio Claudian look to these faces, these very uh, triangular chin here, beardless, close cropped hair, and very pursed lips. We'll see this with successors of his, except, by the way, Nero. And here's a very famous cameo called the Great Cameo of France. And it's um, a stone which is carved out of a material that is, has different colors in it, layered wise, some brown and some white and some black, and then surrounded by a piece of gold. The important part here is that Tiberius is sitting in the center there, and that the gods are looking down on him and other members of the Julio-Claudian family. The point being this, is that Tiberius was given power by Augustus, even though it wasn't his direct son. One of the problems that Romans would have a lot of trouble with in their politics was their succession of power. Because what would happen with dictators, and happens all the time basically, is when a dictator dies and he doesn't have a successor, or she doesn't have a successor, civil war breaks out. And this will happen, we will see with the Romans, but in this case, Augustus was making sure that people knew that he did have a successor. So when he did pass away, there would not be a civil war for power, and the transition would happen peacefully. This is one of the most very important things about our democracy is the peaceful transfer of power. Now, Tiberius was a strange one, and he was very paranoid of his other Romans, and he would frequently have other Roman citizens and senators, whatever, executed, tried and executed, because he was just fearful that they didn't like him, just on the very slightest of suspicions. And he would spend a lot of his time at a place called Sperlonga, along the west coast of Italy, in this cave, where he built a big structure in and around this cave with a series of grandiose sculptures that I'll show you in a moment. What I want to show you here is what's called a piscina in front of the cave. These are very common throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans built them everywhere. And basically what they are fish ponds that are connected with the Mediterranean, so fresh water could flow in and out. And so the Romans would build walls sort of out into the water and then have an opening to let water come in and out. But then they would put a metal gate in front of it so the fish couldn't get out. So they'd gather fish, throw the fish in this pond, and the Romans, being very fond of fish, could just go there and then get a fresh fish and clean it, fillet it, and cook it up. Interestingly enough, I once went in Turkey to one of these and was still being used the same way. You could point out the fish that you wanted and they would catch it for you. Also, interestingly enough, piscina is the modern Greek word for a swimming pool. And we see that here in front of this cave. And here is a reconstruction, or a plan, I should say, of it, not a reconstruction. I want you to pay attention to the round part here that goes into the cave, and then there's a rectangular part that sticks out of the cave. And that little lake there was fed by the Mediterranean. And here is a reconstruction of it. There's a lot of buildings that were at Sperlonga, but we're going to focus on that part in the center, a little bit above, where it goes into the cave. And there, Tiberius had a large sculptural series put in. And then there was a little island in the middle of the casino where they could sit and eat, and then, if they wished, take walks inside the cave to see these various sculptural groups. And these sculptural groups surround the story of Odysseus. I just want to show you one last couple pictures here of what is preserved for us now. This was also excavated in the 20th century, where they found a lot of these statues. The roof actually collapsed during Tiberius's time. Apparently, it almost killed him, and so they were covered over until then. And here we can see, looking out from the cave, and you can see the little area in the middle there where they could eat, separated by water, and that water was, fed by the Mediterranean Ocean. I have a colleague of mine who actually wrote his dissertation on these fish tanks, and they're all over the place. You see them where I work in Greece frequently. And in these, he had this large sculptures of stories of Odysseus. And there are different groups. And I'm just going to show you two groups. One's called the Polyphemus group. The other one is the Scylla group. The Polyphemus group tells a very famous story in the Odyssey, one of the big stories in the Odyssey, of when Odysseus blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus. He is, just to remind you, Odysseus and his men are stuck in a cave, and Polyphemus is eating his men. And so Odysseus comes up with a trick where he offers him some wine to wash down the taste of his men. And unbeknownst to Polyphemus, the wine was 20 times stronger than any wine he's ever had. So he drinks it, he passes out, and while he's asleep, Odysseus and his men blind him, and this allows him to escape. And here we see Polyphemus the giant, very muscular, very muscular, in what's sometimes called a sort of Hellenistic Baroque, but a very sort of overdone muscular body. He looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, right? Every muscle is detailed, and the deep hair in there, and the men standing around. You can see how fragmented this group is. Here's another shot just to give you an idea of the size of these. Just spectacularly large. But notice the heavy musculature, even though Polyphemus is asleep, and then the very active stances of the men around him, right before they blind Polyphemus. Now keep him in mind for a statue I'm going to show you in a little bit, but I'm going to show you the Scylla group first. Now remember that when Odysseus is trying to get home, at one point he has to go through these straits that have Charybdis on one side, and Charybdis is this big, churning whirlpool that sucks boats down. And then Scylla is this monster that sits on the other side on top of a cliff, and a multi-headed beast that comes down and grabs and eats Odysseus's men. And he just has to sail through and get through with whatever men he had. And we can see how fragmented this one is as well. And it's thought that some scholars disagree with these reconstructions because they just think they're too fragmentary. In any case, we can see on the right here the prow of a boat, and what we think is Polyurnus, the steersman for the boat, holding a rudder back there with his left hand. His head, top of his head, is missing. On the left, we see these tentacles coming out, and this lion's sort of biting at them, and so it's sort of pulling the boat down here, or pulling the men away. There's a lot of debate about how accurate this is. There's a lot of reconstruction in this, and you can see on the right the darker pieces are the real pieces, and a lot of the Polyphemus group is even speculative. But we see also a couple faces of Odysseus here, and once again we saw this style in the late Hellenistic period with these this open mouth, these big eyes, and these large, thick locks of beard and hair shooting out from under the cap. Pay attention to these because you've seen something like this. I'll show you in a moment. I just want to show you one last photograph of that guy who was missing the top of his head. This is how it's been reconstructed. It's that this monster is perhaps coming down and grabbing his head. This is all a bit fanciful at times. But the point I wanted to make is Odysseus looks a lot like the Laocoon, which we've talked about before. And some people have also said that perhaps the Laocoon was made at that time, at this first century A.D., and is a copy of an early Hellenistic sculpture. Now, we don't need to go into the detail of this. I've already explained this sculpture. But notice the muscular body, just like we saw in Polyphemus. And the deep locks of hair and the open mouth and the deep set eyes, etc. They were very similar to one another. So Tiberius, created a lot of these sculptures at Spare Longa. He would eventually be assassinated by what is one is he has an obelisk brought from Egypt to be in his circus as a probably a post around which chariot races would have to turn. This is a very old obelisk, Fourth Dynasty. This is one of the earliest you can get in Egyptian history. It's dedicated to the sun god Ra. It would be found much later and incorporated into the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican. And so that obelisk in front of the Vatican actually was brought to Rome by Caligula. Now, another thing that's very interesting about Caligula is there was a lake in Italy called Lake Nemi, where he had these massive barges built, just extraordinarily large ones, on which he could have parties. And he'd invite his friends on there, have massive parties, and the rowers would have to row him around the lake. These had been known for forever. The existence of them had never been lost, but they had sunk under Lake Nemi, in antiquity. And throughout history, various people would try to dive down and get parts of these boat, which they were successful at doing. But it wasn't until Mussolini drained that lake and lifted these massive boats out. Unfortunately, they would be destroyed at the end of World War II by a large fire. So we just have these black and white photos to show you here. But these are two of the sort of the remarkable things that were done by Caligula. However, he was, he was not a good dictator, emperor, and was assassinated. He was assassinated in a stadium by the people, and what happened was that the Praetorian Guard was with him or was there, and Praetorian Guards are the guards simply for the emperor. They're like the Secret Service, and in addition, they were primarily made of a lot of people from Northern Europe or non-Romans. The reason being this is that way they didn't have any affiliations to families and would be loyal only to the emperor. So he gets assassinated. The Praetorian Guard is about to kill all these people that assassinated him in this stadium. But then they decide that there's a relative of Caligula who's a hunchback and a stutterer, and they believe to be a fool, and they can use him as a puppet emperor. And so they take this guy Claudius, who they find whimpering behind a curtain, thinking he's about to be assassinated as well. Well, they make him emperor, and as it turns out, Claudius was probably one of the best emperors of the Julio Claudians. He is shown here in various styles here. The important thing to keep in mind is, as we see in the bronze in the center, these were once again portraits of these men, and these are accurate portraits. We know what these guys look like. Here he is shown on the right as Jupiter with the Roman eagle as a strut, and shown very fit and strong, which he was not. But he would do a lot of important things as Roman emperor. First of all, he was very well educated. and he would bring a lot of changes to how the government was run, and basically making positions, promotions, etc., based on merit and not just on patronage or family connections. And even a slave could be promoted as a up to being an advisor of his, if that slave were smart enough. And indeed, he did make some laws that made the slaves' lives much easier. And he did his best to reorganize the infrastructure of Rome. One of the fascinating things that he did was he made sure that a lot of the aqueducts were fixed, and so they could supply Rome with water. Here's a gate called the Porta Maggiore Aqueduct, where he brought together several aqueducts, and we can see that's marble stone gate there with the two arched entranceways and then the triangular pediments in between, a style that we'll see developed on by the Romans. But these were really important for the Romans. First of all, not only the flowing water was it good for the hygiene, but Romans, as we will see, loved their baths and loved their fountains, and so bringing this water in was a pretty important thing for the locals, and just showed how genuinely concerned Claudius was for the people of Rome and the empire, and it wasn't just about him. Now, one of the things he would do as well is he would take Britain, or Britannia, as you see there. Now, remember when I talked about Augustus and he talked about the Pax Romana, and that he didn't want anybody to increase the size of the empire. He didn't want them to take any more lands, everything to be at peace. Well, if that were the case, they would have had everything on the top legend there in the red, the pink, the orange, and the yellow. But the green were things that were added after Augustus, the dark green and then the light green. And then now not all of this was done by Claudius, but two important ones were. First of all, Mauretania, which would finish basically the total control of the Circum-Mediterranean, all the shores of the Mediterranean. And also, very importantly, he would go into England and take England, which would have ramifications on history to this very day. This was, desired. It was desired to do this by previous emperors, including Julius Caesar, but none of them were able to do it. And one of the reasons Claudius was able to do so was because he would listen to his generals, and he wouldn't override them. And therefore he's recorded by the historians very favorably. And as I've mentioned in earlier lectures, when the Romans took a place, they would build a Roman military camp, and they would build one at a place called Londonium, which would be the basis for London. And there are still bits and pieces of Roman London that can be found in the city, but of course, most of it has been built over. He is thought to have been assassinated by his wife, which is a completely other story, and succeeded by Nero, the very famous Nero, who would be the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Nero, we see here, is shown different than his predecessors. He has a beard, for starters. His face is a bit puffier. Nero was known for being very interested in the arts, and considered himself quite a good musician and artist in general. And indeed, his reign at first was quite good. Here we see a picture of him being crowned by his mother. Once again, we get a good idea of what exactly they looked like. Here we can see Nero in his military garb, which he really did not deserve, but nevertheless, he was emperor. Nero would be famous for his persecution of the Christians, which was brutal, as well as the fire of Rome, where we've all heard the story that he played his violin or fiddle while Rome burnt. And a lot of historians think he caused this. And the reason that he caused it was to build his house called the Domus Aurea. You can see in the middle of this slide, or the Golden House. Now, I want you to pay attention to the line on the left where it says Forum Romanum and then Via Sacra. That's the road going through the Forum. In a previous lecture, I said Appian Way. I was mistaken. It's the Sacred Way, Via Sacra. So it's going through the center of the city. And it's called the Golden House. And it was reported by a lot of historians. Not much of it remained for a long time because later on Trajan, who we'll get to in a later lecture, built a bath complex on top of it. But portions of it have been found. And they preserve for us a lot of the great paintings of the Roman period in the city of Rome. Now, these will not be as good as the ones we will see at Pompeii. And so I'm going to leave the lecture, a long lecture on Roman wall paintings for when we get to Pompeii. I just want to point out that here we see, these are some of the best we have for Rome. But since Rome was occupied ever since, and unlike Pompeii, it wasn't covered over with, it was not covered over by a volcanic eruption. People have been living there and these things were preserved for us. But he has these large white backgrounds, these garlanded windows, or paintings of windows looking out. It was a very large structure. We can see people walking through parts that are preserved here. Here's another part that's preserved. We can see the paintings on the roof. And it's thought that, he had Rome burnt so he could have his big house built here for his parties. This is an interesting part here. It's called the Sphinx Hall. It was only discovered last year. And obviously it had a lot of sphinxes in it, and hence the archaeologists gave it that name. So there's still parts of this that are still being discovered. It was a massive structure. We can see here on the left in this reconstruction, he had a big lake in the middle with boats, etc., and a big building with a dome there. But I wanted to pay attention to the background. You can see that statue there. And notice that in the right, we see a reconstruction of the statue, but with the Roman Colosseum behind it. Well, what happened was this. The Colosseum was not built yet when Nero was the emperor. It wouldn't be built till, once again, Trajan. So on the left in the reconstruction, there is no Colosseum. But the way the Colosseum got its name was, originally the Romans would have just called it Trajan's amphitheater, but it got named the Colosseum because it stood by the Colossus of Nero, this statue we've been told about, we don't really have. And that's how the word Colosseum came to mean a sporting arena because of this statue. Etymologically, it doesn't make much sense otherwise, and it's just an act. After Nero would eventually be assassinated, and the Julio-Claudian Empire would end, and there would be a series of civil wars for 1 year, and there would be 4 different emperors. It's called the Year of the Four. I will get back to this in the next lecture.